Grace to you and peace, and welcome to tonight's penultimate installment of Stories That Didn't Make the Felt Board, as we look at the last days of King Saul's reign and his desperation that drives him to the so-called Witch of Endor, a necromancer who, at the king's direction, violates the Torah and Saul's own injunction against sorcery to consult with the ghost of the prophet Samuel. After spending a while in Judges, we're jumping forward into the saga of the kings, that is, the books known as 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings, a sweeping narrative that begins with Samuel's birth and the reign of King Saul, and goes all the way through the fall of Judah and the Babylonian captivity. Tonight we are at the end of 1 Samuel, reading about the last days of Saul's reign. The story of Saul is a bit of a wild ride. We see his rise to power early in the book, and then we watch as he gradually descends into paranoia, while David ascends from shepherd to accidental soldier to future king, though he doesn't take the throne until the first chapters of 2 Samuel. Recall that over the course of the story, David curries favor with the royal court and the people through displays of his military prowess. You might remember the felt cutout of David slaying the flannel-graph giant Goliath. As he climbed through the ranks, the people began to sing his praises, comparing him to Saul directly, saying, "Saul has slain his thousands, and David his tens of thousands." The shepherd warrior found favor in the eyes of the prophet Samuel, who anointed him future king in the field, and with Jonathan, the son of King Saul, and David eventually marries Saul's daughter. We mentioned this briefly in the story of Rachel and the household idols. But even before the marriage, David's future father-in-law has already tried to kill him. Twice. As the pressure mounted, David fled to enemy territory and eventually entered into the service of a foreign king. With David now fighting openly against him, Saul's descent into madness accelerated, and he became more of a tyrant, even going so far as to murder priests. So tonight we find ourselves near the end of 1 Samuel, with the forces of Gath, including David, and Israel, led by King Saul, ready to march into battle against each other. And this brings us to the Witch of Endor. As he consolidated his power, Saul banned witches and fortune-tellers from the land. But then God shut off communication with Saul. No prophet could bring the word of the Lord to the tyrannical king. And this left Saul desperate for insight into the coming battle. How is it going to end? And so, increasingly isolated, Saul tells his courtiers, "Seek out for me a woman who is a medium, so that I may go and inquire of her." He's directed to a woman in the town of Endor. Donning a disguise, Saul sets out to consult with this necromancer, one who communicates with the dead. And in a scene almost straight out of Law and Order, he walks in and he asks her to consult with the spirit, but she responds by telling him, "Well, it's against the law. I couldn't possibly help you." Saul, a good undercover cop, promises that no harm will come to her. So she takes the gig and asks who he wants to talk to. He tells her that he's looking for the spirit of Samuel. And she yells, "You are Saul!" And he repeats his pledge of safety. The answer is more important to him than Law and Order. Summoned from the realm of the dead, Samuel's a little bit grumpy. "Why have you disturbed me?" he asks. Saul lays out the situation, and Samuel breaks the bad news. "It's too late, Saul. You've lost the kingdom, and tomorrow you and your sons will die at the hands of the Philistines." Confronted with the news of his impending death, Saul collapses onto the floor. The necromancer goes to him in a rather tender moment and tells him to eat. The pouting king refuses, but the woman and his courtiers prevail on him to accept the offer, so she slaughters a fatted calf and bakes a few pieces of bread. Having eaten, Saul departs into the darkness to meet his fate. Tonight we're going to take the order a little bit differently, because to understand what's going on, we have to do so thinking about other similar stories. Throughout the Mediterranean world and the ancient Near East, nothing about the story is out of the ordinary. While we might have images of tarot card readers, crystal balls, and Miss Cleo and her 1900 number, and while we tend to read our understanding of a monotheistic contemporary Judaism back into the story, the history of religion is so much more complicated. Because religion in ancient Israel wasn't the neatly organized monotheistic belief system centralized around the tabernacle and the temple that we so often picture. Because even within the Hebrew Bible itself, we see competing places of worship set up as high places. And as numerous scholars have pointed out, it's unlikely that the Torah and the prophets would devote so much time to condemning polytheism and divination if such practices weren't commonplace among the Israelites. And this is borne out by archaeological evidence throughout Israel, both in the Canaanite period and in the Israelite period. We see temples outside of Jerusalem as well as temples to pagan gods from the Israelite period. So for a few points of comparison, let's look at a few similar concepts. Throughout the Mediterranean, but especially well known among the Greeks and Romans, are oracles. These are mediums who would channel the gods and provide utterances of the future. And like Saul, leaders would consult oracles for a glimpse of the future. Should I go to battle against this enemy, or should I wait them out? When should I plant my crops? If I do it now, will a flood come and eliminate them? This is what most people think of when they think about prophets and prophecy, but that's a different matter entirely. Most of the prophetic literature in the Hebrew Bible is concerned not with what happens at some far-off point in the future, but with how God feels about what's happening today. Most famously among the oracles, there was one at Delphi who was supposed to channel the sun god Apollo. Other methods to discern the future included reading the entrails of sacrificed animals. Well, this spot on the liver means that a good thing is going to happen. But you see this sort of smudge over here, this little tumor? Well, that means that we're going to have bad weather. So maybe hold off on planting the crops. Others, of course, would look for signs among the stars, what we would today call astrology. And then there was the casting of lots, which is sort of like dice. You ask the question, you toss the stone or the lot, and you read the answer from among which side is facing up. Necromancy, or consulting with the dead, fits into this same system of foreknowledge through communicating with the divine presence, especially in parts of the world where ancestors were venerated as lesser gods. You would find a medium, you would get them to call up the spirit, and you would say, hey, go ask the god, find out what the future holds. What's worth noting here then is that in the view of the Hebrew Bible, the issue isn't that these methods are ineffective. What's worth noting here is that in the view of the Hebrew Bible, the issue isn't that these methods are ineffective or a waste of time. The author of 1 Samuel isn't scoffing that Saul would waste his time by going and using what is essentially a Ouija board, but rather that these methods are illegitimate. They work, but you shouldn't do them. They're not bad because they don't work. The necromancer is in fact able to summon Samuel's spirit. But rather, this method is bad because they require the inquirer, be it a king, a general, a merchant, or a shepherd, to trust in a spiritual entity other than the Lord. The Torah and the prophets repeatedly condemn such practices and link impending crises such as the destruction of Israel or the beginning of the Babylonian exile to magic, to sorcery, to divination, not because they're a waste of time, but because they require the user to break the covenant to worship the Lord God alone. So we might compare the so-called Witch of Endor to other women who are entrusted with prophetic gifts. Think about Miriam and Deborah, who we've already seen, or the so-called wise women of Tekoa and Abel who pop up later in 2 Samuel, or the prophet Huldah who shows up a few books later in 2 Kings. The wise women, compared with the necromancer, function in a manner similar to the prophet Nathan. Nathan confronts King David after the incident with Bathsheba and Uriah, telling a story that draws forth David's condemnation of his own actions. Just so, the woman at Tekoa tells David a story that draws forth his own desire to reconcile with his son, Absalom. So where does this leave us with this bizarre story of necromancers and witches? What's the issue here? It's faith. Yes, one might very easily do as the pagan neighbors do and consult with an oracle or a necromancer to divine the future. But can the Israelites trust fully in God? For us today, we might easily trust in hoarding money or guns or supporting state-sanctioned violence to keep us safe. It works for our neighbors. But can we trust fully in God to deliver us?